So my sepsis story is about my daughter, Cleo, and it happened just over a year ago. So it was April last year, April 2022. And she was sort of a healthy, happy 2-and-a-bit-year-old at the time. She came home from nursery and was absolutely fine. We put her to bed and noticed she had a bit of temperature. So we gave her some Calpol and just put her to bed because she's obviously a toddler who goes to nursery. So we didn't really think anything of it. And a few hours later, we kind of just checked the baby monitor and she was just lying awake in her cot. So we went upstairs and she had a temperature of 40. So we gave her some Nurofen and it didn't come down. And we sort of sat with her and we checked her over and she had one tiny little dot on her back. That was it, nothing else. And she seemed okay in herself. She didn't seem sad or drowsy or anything. She just seemed like she had a temperature. So we kind of watched her for a bit. And then after a couple of hours, the temperature still didn't come down. So we were going to call 111, but we lived like 2 minutes from our local hospital. And we knew that for a child, they'd probably tell us to go to A&E. And it was sort of 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. So we thought it'd be fairly quiet. So my husband took her in. She got checked over and came home about 2 or 3 hours later with the diagnosis of probably just a viral infection. The following morning, she got into our bed about 6 a.m. and promptly vomited, which this is a kid I'd never seen her be sick before in her whole life. So that kind of made us think, oh, she's got a tummy bug. That'll be why she's been so poorly. And then she carried on being sick about 10 times. And then she stopped and she just sort of was very drowsy and tired. But we kind of just assumed it was a stomach bug. I then went out for the day and my husband stayed at home with her. I came home about 3 o'clock and he said to me, it was a Friday, and my husband said to me, do you think we should just call the GP? Because we're going into the weekend, just want to double check she's okay so we don't end up in A&E again this weekend. So we called the GP and thankfully he just said, take her to A&E now. Because we'd mentioned her being sick so many times, he was concerned about her being dehydrated. So we took her to A&E. Well, I took her to A&E this time. I was also heavily pregnant at the time. And we went in and she got checked over. And it was all very kind of laissez-faire, like toddler with a temperature. I mean, you know, I suppose it's a pediatric A&E as well, so they must see it all the time, toddlers with temperatures, and it's fussy parents. And I definitely felt a little bit like I was being a bit over the top. And a doctor eventually saw her and said her heart rate was a bit high and asked if we could make sure we got a urine sample from her. And I just couldn't, because at that point she wasn't weeing anymore. And she was just lying in this cubicle for hours and hours. Eventually the doctor came back again and said, look, we'll keep her in for the night. She just seems like a bit of a grumpy toddler with a virus, but I just want that heart rate to go back down. So anyway, we were moved to sort of a slightly different part of A&E. My husband came and swapped over with me and he spent the night there. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, he texted me to say she'd done a wee in her nappy, he'd noticed. And he said, I'm not going to tell anyone because I'm worried they're going to send us home. And I was like, okay, fine. And I think his intuition had kicked in, whereas mine hadn't really. He just didn't want them to go, okay, fine, she's fine, let's get her home, she's done a wee now. So anyway, the following day, she sat in A&E for the whole day again. By this point, she wasn't awake, she just hadn't woken up, she was just lying there. And around sort of in the morning and the morning rounds, the doctor had said, I'll probably do some bloods later. And this isn't me having a moan, it's just the situation, that's how it happened. And in the evening, eventually about 5 o'clock, they did bloods. So she'd been in hospital for 24 hours by that point before they'd done any bloods. Her rash had grown to a full body rash, and the doctors thought she was allergic to the cream that they put on babies when they're having blood tests to kind of numb the skin area. And I was like, I don't think so. By this point, I was back in again. There was a lot of swapping back and forth. I don't think it is, because she's had the start of that rash since she sort of had a temperature. But she had the blood test done, and I then went home. My husband swapped back in. This was kind of still quite COVID, not COVID times, but we were wearing masks and you were only allowed one parent. So I went home, my husband took over, and I had a call. My husband called me and just said, we've had the results back. You need to come back now. They've done the blood tests, and there's something that they look for that's basically an infection marker, which I'd never heard of before, but I know quite a lot about now. And it should be sort of, I think, between 0 and 10-ish for like a healthy human. And hers was 352. They didn't know what it was yet. They still didn't actually think it was sepsis, and they didn't know what was causing it, but they knew that that number was too high, and things were actually very serious. They then managed to kind of hook her up to some antibiotics and some fluids, and then we were admitted. The following morning, the consultant came in, and they were wondering, they didn't know, because they still hadn't had any results back for what had actually caused this infection. And they were wondering if it was something called PIMS TS, which is something that children were getting after having COVID. And she'd had COVID in the January, and this was the sort of start of April. And they said it was they either thought it was that, which was terrifying because obviously it hadn't really been around for that long, or it was sepsis, but they didn't know what it was caused by. And they started a treatment that was kind of to cover both. And then later on that evening, they finally got the blood test results back to say it was strep A that she had. So she'd had strep A and also RSV, which I think probably the two together had just taken her down. But I suppose what was scary for me as a parent, or for us as parents, was that she was fine. She went to nursery. We had 1 day's notice of her being ill. There was no sign of strep A. She didn't go off her food. She didn't complain of a sore throat. She didn't have any of the kind of signs that you look for. And that was really terrifying because there was just no warning. And she'd obviously had it, and we just didn't know how long, from where. And anyway, she was in hospital for 3 weeks. They treated her, and her numbers came down, and then they popped back up again. And she was just this like swollen little thing, just full of fluid. She had fluid on her heart, her kidneys had failed, her other organs had all started to function abnormally. All of her blood platelets was like completely bottomed out. We hovered between ICU and the high dependency unit for the entire time, which was horrific because we just didn't know what doctor was going to say what. And obviously, and like, you know, thankfully, luckily for us, we took her home and she recovered. And I think it probably took her I'd probably say 6 months to get back to full weight and full health. A further 6 months. She was so skinny because she just didn't eat. She was on a feeding tube. She couldn't really walk because obviously she just lay there for 3 weeks. All of her muscles had deteriorated. Just like little things like all of her skin and her nails peeled off on her hands and her feet, and her hair kind of was burnt from all the treatment, and just these small things. And like, thankfully, we were really, really lucky because we had 2 lots of friends who were medical, and we didn't Google anything the whole time we were in hospital. And we were there 24 hours a day between, like, we were both allowed to stay in the end in her room, but we were there the whole time. And we just didn't Google anything about sepsis because we were terrified. So if we had any questions, we'd either obviously ask the doctors and nurses there, and we'd ask our friends what we should be doing, or we'd get people to Google stuff for us. And I think we kind of were made like much more shocked and upset when we finally came out of hospital and we knew we were in the clear, because we Googled what could have happened and how close we were to losing her. And while we're in the hospital, we were told, but it didn't sink in, that they didn't know which way things were going to go. And these were doctors, like, we're so fortunate because the hospital that we're near has a specialist paediatric infectious diseases department. They were all there. Like, it's one of the best children's hospitals in the world. And they were stood there solemnly saying, we don't know. And it didn't really hit home, I think, because you're just in sort of fight or flight mode. And it was only when we kind of got out that we kind of realised that it was just such a brush, and how, I suppose, just how maybe how easily it could have been avoided, that a level of illness in her, and how close we were to losing her could have been avoided if maybe we'd potentially been more alert and it had been spoken about in A&E. There was a few different things that saved her life. Obviously, the doctors and the nurses saved her life with their medical intervention and their knowledge, but the GP that told us to go to A&E, and my husband saying, I'm not going to tell the nurse that she's wet her nappy, I think were the two things that possibly saved her life. Because had we gone home, I don't know what would have happened. Even like post illness, like during the time we were in hospital, it was just so heightened that you were just getting through the days. It was that after she left hospital and she looked like a little like stick doll, that I found it really difficult, because I was like, oh my God, she can't run. And this could have all been avoided. But on the plus side, she was so little that I don't think she won't remember it. Thankfully, we're really lucky about that too. She's absolutely grand. She's thriving. She's at preschool. She's healthy and happy. We are still under the care of the consultants at the hospital. She's due her final sort of consultation, I think, in a few weeks' time. There were quite a lot of checks around her kidneys, because obviously they took quite a bit of a battering, and that took some time to repair. But yeah, on the whole, you would never know. Your gut instinct and that your parental intuition, whether it's the mother or the father, is critical, and that medicine is amazing and doctors are incredible, but it's not an exact science, and it takes a whole team of people to make the right diagnosis, and that includes the parents as well. So yeah, don't doubt yourself if you genuinely think that something else is wrong.